The water was cold enough that October morning to make my ankles ache, but I kept cutting. The sickle borrowed from my neighbor's shed had a thin blade, worn to a curve from decades of use, and it moved through the stalks in a clean whisper if I kept my wrist loose and let the weight do the work. The rice stood about 3 feet tall, heavy-headed, bending gold in the gray light before sunrise. Each bundle I laid flat across my left arm, each handful of wet stalks pressing cold against my grandfather's barn coat. My breath came out in small white clouds above the sink. That low 3-acre pocket at the far corner of the property that Posey County Bottomland had swallowed and released, every spring since anyone could remember. I knew he was there without looking up. I could feel the silence of a man standing still at a fence line. It has a different quality than the silence of an empty field. $6. That's what they laughed about. I kept cutting. The sun was barely suggesting itself beyond the sycamores along Cypress Creek, laying a pale line across the eastern ridgeline. My boots sank a little with each step, the ground soft but firm enough to hold, the way it had been all summer since I'd managed the water the way the notebook showed, slow flooding to 2 inches, held through June, drained by degrees in August. I didn't fully understand it the first time I read it. I understood it the second time. By the third reading, I'd committed the hand-drawn diagrams to memory. The stalks came down clean, bundle after bundle. I heard the fence wire shift once, the soft mechanical sound of someone leaning their weight against a post, and I finally allowed myself to look. He was standing at the property line in a brown canvas jacket, both hands resting on the top wire, watching without expression. 67 years old, the man who had owned this parcel before the county took it for back taxes. The man who had let a $6 tax lien go unpaid for 3 years rather than spend the money on ground he was certain would never produce anything. He had watched me from that same fence line in April when I first prepared the field, and he had laughed then, a short, dismissive sound, not cruel exactly, just confident in a way that men his age sometimes were about the limits of what a boy could understand. He was not laughing now. I turned back to the rice. Another bundle. Another. The sickle made its quiet sound through the stems, and the creek moved behind the tree line, and somewhere across the field, the farm's one good rooster announced the morning, to no one in particular. I had been 18 years old since February. I had been running this farm since January, when they put my grandfather in the ground and handed me everything he owed. The morning we buried my grandfather was the coldest Tuesday in January that I can remember, January 13th, 1953, a day so still the smoke from the farmhouse chimney went straight up like a pencil line against a white sky. The ground was frozen hard enough that the men from the funeral home had to use a mechanical auger to open the grave, and even then, the hole had ragged, brick-colored edges that didn't look like earth at all, but like something broken. 7 people came. The pastor from Mount Carmel Methodist, 2 neighbors who shared a fence line with the north pasture, a woman from town I didn't know, who had apparently known my grandfather from the feed store and felt it was the decent thing. The bank sent no one, though I learned later that First Farmers Bank of Mount Vernon already knew about the $340 note and already had a man assigned to the file. I wore my grandfather's wool coat because it was the only one on the property that would keep out that kind of cold. It was too wide in the shoulders and too long in the sleeves, and I stood there at the graveside with my hands in the pockets feeling the weight of it, and I thought about how recently those pockets had belonged to someone else. The drive back to the farm was 4 miles on County Road. I did it alone in the truck, a 1941 Ford half-ton that started only if you gave it 3 pumps of the accelerator and a kind word, and sometimes not even then. That afternoon, it started on the first try. I don't know why I remember that. The farm was 47 acres total, the house, the barn, the tool shed, the chicken coop, 11 laying hens, 1 draft horse named nothing in particular, but called Mare, and a field arrangement that my grandfather had worked for 30 years without much improvement. Corn on the upper ground. The lower corner, the sink, where Cypress Creek backed up every spring, had been left fallow since before I was born. It flooded. Everyone knew it flooded. The $340 owed to First Farmers Bank of Mount Vernon was not a surprise. My grandfather had mentioned the debt in the way old men sometimes mention things they've decided not to solve, with a mild tone, as though it were someone else's problem. In a sense, now it was. Mine. I sat at the kitchen table that evening, with the bank's paperwork and the farm's account book, and a kerosene lamp turned up as far as it would go, and I added and subtracted until the numbers stopped changing. They came out the same every time. The farm could not cover the debt on corn alone, not this year, maybe not any year at these prices. I was 18 years old. The county, I would later learn, was already placing quiet bets on how long before I quit. The Posey County tax auction was held the second Saturday of every March in the basement of the courthouse in Mount Vernon, and it smelled like all government basements smell: pipe tobacco absorbed into plaster over decades, old paper, the particular cold of a room that never quite warms. I drove in on the 14th in my grandfather's truck, a 1941 Dodge half-ton that pulled left when the road was wet. The road was wet. It had been wet since February. I had $6. That was not a figure of speech or a rounding down. I had counted it the night before on the kitchen table under the kerosene lamp, a $2 bill my grandfather had kept folded behind his driver's license, 3 singles from the coffee tin above the stove, and $1's worth of quarters in a small cloth bag that had once held seeds. $6.11, if I counted the pennies. I did not count the pennies. I needed the 6 to remain a clean number in my mind. The sink parcel was listed third on the auction sheet, described in the county's flat language as 3.2 acres, Bottomland, Cypress Creek corridor, unimproved, tax lien of $6.00. The man who had let the lien lapse was there in the room, a neighbor, 67 years old, a big man who had farmed the land adjacent to my grandfather's for as long as I could remember. He sat in the second row with his hat on, which no one bothered to mention because it was his habit and everyone knew it. He had let the parcel go because it flooded. He had owned it for 11 years and not once planted it successfully, and when the county had come for its $6, he had, by his own account I would hear repeated later, simply decided the land wasn't worth the bother. When my bid came, $6, stated once, quietly, because there was no competition and the auctioneer looked mildly embarrassed for me, the neighbor turned in his seat and looked at me with an expression I had not quite seen before, not anger, something closer to amusement at an unexpected source. He laughed. It was not a short laugh. It was the kind that builds, that invites the room, and the room, not cruelly, just honestly, answered. A few chuckles from the back. Someone said something low to someone else. The auctioneer brought the gavel down and called my name for the record and wrote it in his book, and I folded my copy of the receipt and put it in my coat pocket, and the neighbor was still smiling when I stood to leave. I did not look at him on the way out. Not out of pride, I just had work to do, and the drive home pulled left the whole way, and I needed to think. The drive home took 40 minutes on a road that hadn't been graded since November, and the truck pulled left the whole way it always did when the temperature dropped below freezing, and I let it pull because correcting it all the time wore out your arms, and I'd learned to steer against the drift with just enough pressure to keep the line. I was thinking about the water, not the money, not the neighbor still smiling in his folded chair, the water itself, the way it had stood in that low corner every April I could remember, the way it collected from the southeast and didn't move for weeks, the way Cypress Creek pushed over its bank in the second or third week of March with a reliability that the rest of the farm refused to offer. I had walked the sink once before as a boy, 9 or 10, following my grandfather at a distance he didn't know about. He had stood at the edge of it in his rubber boots and looked at the standing water and said something quiet that I didn't hear, and then walked back toward the barn without trying to cross it. I had not been invited. I walked it for the first time, as its owner, on a Wednesday, the 18th of March, 4 days after the auction. The temperature was 38 degrees, and the sky was the color of old tin, and the water in the sink came up over my boot tops in 2 places. I didn't mind. I was paying attention to something else. What I was paying attention to was the shape of it. The water didn't pool randomly. It pooled according to something, a long, shallow grade from the east, that fed the lowest point near the cottonwood stand, a slight rise along the north edge that held the water in the way a cupped hand holds rain. The creek overflow came in from the south corner through a break in the bank maybe 4 feet wide. The whole 3.2 acres wasn't drowning indiscriminately. It was filling the way a vessel fills, with a logic to it, a sequence. The water came in from one direction, settled into the lowest point, and drained. When it drained, from the northeast corner, through a natural channel, not much wider than a boot. I didn't know yet what I was looking for. I want to be honest about that. I had no plan. I had a receipt in my coat pocket and a piece of land that had made a room of grown men laugh, and I walked it, the way you walk something that belongs to you for the first time, slowly, and with the particular attention you pay to a thing that cost you something. I pulled out my own notebook, a school composition book I'd carried since October, half filled with feed calculations and repair lists, and I began drawing the water lines, not the land, the water, where it entered, where it settled, where it wanted to go. The root cellar had been on my list since February, when I found 3 jars of my grandfather's canned tomatoes gone to mold on the lower shelf. Spring vegetable storage meant clearing it properly, pulling everything out, checking for rot, relining the shelves with fresh newspaper. I'd been putting it off. The cellar ran under the kitchen, accessed by a hatch in the floor beside the stove, and it had the particular cold and smell of a place that hasn't been properly aired since the previous century. Not unpleasant exactly, just old. Stone walls, sweating with the damp of April, a single kerosene lantern hook above the bottom step, 2 plank shelves running the length of the east and west walls. I went down on a Wednesday morning, 3rd week of April. I had the lantern lit, and my composition book tucked under my arm out of habit. The west wall cleared in under an hour. Mostly empty canning jars, a few good ones, a few cracked, a wooden crate of seed potatoes that had already started sprouting pale white fingers toward the light. The east wall took longer. The lower shelf had a stack of burlap grain sacks folded flat, some rusted tin cans with the labels gone, a broken-handled crock. I moved it all out, and when I set the last crock on the step and brought the lantern back to check the shelf, I saw it. The east wall behind the lower shelf wasn't flush. There was a seam in the stone. Not a natural crack, but a rectangular seam, the kind a hand had made. A panel, maybe 18 inches wide and 12 inches tall, fitted so closely into the wall that I might have looked at it 100 times and called it shadow. I got my fingers into the left edge and pulled. It came loose with a sound like an exhaled breath. Behind it was a small stone recess, maybe 8 inches deep. Inside, a quart mason jar with a ring lid, sealed in wax. And beside it, a notebook. Small, I'd say 4 inches by 6. Brown leather cover, cracked at the spine, with a brass clasp that had gone green at the hinge. I took the jar out first. In the bottom, grain. Unhulled, short and rounded, unlike any corn or wheat I knew. In grease pencil on the lid, Sept. 1931. I set it down and opened the notebook. The writing was Japanese. I knew that much, and nothing more. Columns of script running top to bottom, characters I couldn't sound out or guess at. But between the columns, on nearly every page, were drawings, diagrams, fields divided into sections, with arrows indicating water flow. Channel measurements written in both Japanese and, here and there, in English numerals. A sketch that could only be a field dike. Another that showed a breach point and an inflow. I sat down on the bottom step with the lantern between my feet and turned every page slowly. I didn't understand the words. I didn't need to. I spent 3 days trying to read that notebook on my own. I'd sit at the kitchen table after supper with the lantern close and a cup of coffee going cold, and I'd trace the characters with my eye, the way you trace a fence line on a map, looking for where it leads, not what it says. I could read the English numerals, 12 inches, 6 feet, a measurement I kept seeing that I eventually recognized as a depth mark, but the words stayed closed to me, and I knew that if I couldn't open them, the notebook was just a beautiful thing I didn't understand. There was one name I did know. My grandfather had mentioned him once. A Japanese truck farmer over in Gibson County sold vegetables at the Owensville market. He had known my great-grandmother, Walter had said, from the early days. I found his name on a card tucked inside the notebook's back cover, written in pencil in a different hand than the rest. English letters, small and careful. I drove to Gibson County on a Thursday morning, 22 miles on Route 65, and found his roadside stand just where the card said it would be. He was smaller than I expected, 71 years old, with a face that had been weathered the same way old fence posts get weathered, harder, not softer. He was tying bundles of green onions when I pulled up. I didn't know how to begin, so I just set the notebook on his table. He stopped. He put down the onions. He looked at the notebook for a long moment without touching it, then looked at me. "Where did you find this?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. I told him. The root cellar, the false panel, the jar of seed beside it. He picked it up then, carefully, and opened the clasp. He turned 2 pages and I watched his face. Something in it shifted, not grief exactly, but something adjacent to grief. The recognition of something you thought was gone. He told me about her, Hana. She had come from Kumamoto Prefecture in 1902, a picture bride, 18 years old, same age I was standing there. She had arrived in Indiana speaking almost no English and carrying, in her luggage, a small amount of unhulled rice seed she had grown up watching her family tend. She had spent the 1920s running quiet experiments in the lowest corner of the farm, the place everyone else avoided. She called it, he told me, the right kind of wrong land. Too wet for corn, too flat to drain, but she had seen something in it that no one born to Indiana corn country would have seen. She knew water, he said simply. She understood what it was for. He set the notebook down on the table between us, smoothed the cover once with his palm, and told me he would come in the spring. I drove home with the windows down, even though it was cold. The Grange Hall in Stewartsville smelled the same in April as it did in November. Wood oil and old coffee, and the particular damp of a building that never quite dried out between winters. I had not planned to go. Mr. Sato's visit had settled something in me, and I had been working quietly ever since, reading the notebook in the evenings with a Japanese-English dictionary I had ordered through the Mount Vernon Library, copying the irrigation diagrams into my own notebook in pencil, measuring the sink with a length of baling twine on Saturdays. I had not told anyone. There was nothing yet to tell. But a neighbor from the East Parcel mentioned the meeting at the feed store, said the extension office was going to speak about Bottomland drainage, and something about that word, drainage, made me think I should hear what they had to say. 30 men, give or take, most of them twice my age. I took a seat near the back and kept my coat on. The county agricultural agent stood at the front with a hand-drawn map of the western county lowlands tacked to a corkboard. He was 52 years old and had the particular confidence of a man who has held the same job for 20 years and mistaken that for wisdom. He talked about tile drainage, about the USDA's Bottomland survey from 1949, about the fundamental unsuitability of flood-prone parcels for row crop production. He talked for 40 minutes. During questions, a man 2 rows ahead of me turned around, not to me specifically, but to the room, and asked whether anyone had plans for the Posey County sink parcels this season. I don't know what made me speak. Maybe it was Hannah, 18 years old, stepping off a train into a country whose language she didn't speak, carrying seed in her luggage. Maybe I was just tired of sitting quiet. I said I was putting in rice. The room didn't laugh all at once. It was more gradual than that. A few men, then a murmur, then the agent at the front, setting his pointer down on the table with a slow, deliberate patience that was worse than laughter. He said it was a child's fantasy, those exact words. He said the growing season was insufficient, the soil chemistry wrong, the market non-existent for a single small plot. He listed 4 reasons in the measured tone of a man who expects no further questions. On his way out, the man who had sold me those 3.2 acres for $6 repeated the phrase to the man beside him. Child's fantasy. He didn't say it to my face. He didn't need to. I drove home on Route 69 with both hands on the wheel and the windows up. I didn't replay the room. I didn't rehearse what I should have said. Monday morning, I went down to the root cellar, lifted the mason jar off the shelf, and carried it out to the sink. The jar was heavier than it looked, or maybe my arms were tired. I set it on the ground at the edge of the sink and stood there a moment while the morning light came across the field in that flat, colorless way it does in early April, before the green has committed to anything. I had Hannah's notebook open on a flat stone beside me, weighted against the wind with my boot. The diagrams were small and precise, lines indicating water depth at different stages, arrows showing which direction the flow should move, measurements I had converted from her annotations into feet and inches on a piece of notebook paper I kept folded in my shirt pocket. She had drawn the ditch lines in ink, no erasing, like she'd already seen it work somewhere else and was just recording what she knew. I spent the first 2 weeks of May cutting the intake ditch by hand with a spade and a mattock. It ran 41 feet from the lowest bend of the property fence down to the northwest corner of the sink, where Cypress Creek's overflow already pooled. I graded it with a board, dragged flat behind me, checking the level with a mason's bubble I borrowed from the barn. The seedlings went in the second week of May, pushed into the flooded mud in rows I'd measured with a knotted cord, the way the notebook showed. Then the cold came back. 3 nights in the last week of May, temperatures dropping to the upper 30s. I stood at the sink at 5 in the morning on the 26th and watched a quarter of the seedlings go pale. Not dead yet, but pale in the way that means they're deciding. I didn't have enough seed to replant. I had what I had. I went back to the notebook. There was a passage I had read but not understood the first time, a note in the margin beside one of the water diagrams, smaller than the rest of her writing, where she described raising the water level to hold warmth in the root zone during cold nights. The water itself, she wrote, held temperature longer than the air. I raised the depth by 2 inches that morning, working the intake board by hand until the water covered the base of the stems. I went back every morning for a week. By the 6th of June, most of what I thought was dying had steadied. The pale rows deepened back to green. Not all of them. 1/5 of the planting was gone, and I accepted that as a cost, the same way I accepted the broken mattock handle I wrapped in electrical tape and kept using. You work with what holds. Through June and into July, the sink became something I didn't quite have a word for. The water was still, and the green was dense, and in the morning, there was a mist that sat low over the rows that felt like it belonged to a different county, a different season. I checked the water level every day. The letter came on a Tuesday in the 3rd week of July. I found it under the screen door when I came in from the morning water check, the envelope damp at one corner from the dew that had collected on the porch boards overnight. First Farmers Bank of Mount Vernon. I already knew the shape of the debt, $340, due November 1st, but seeing it typed on bank letterhead made it concrete in a way that my grandfather's voice had not. I sat at the kitchen table and read it twice. The language was courteous and exact. They wished to remind me, as the estate's successor, that the outstanding balance would require settlement no later than November 1st, 1953, and that the bank stood ready to discuss arrangements should circumstances warrant. Circumstances. I set the letter on the table and looked out the window toward the cornfield. It had been a dry summer. Not catastrophic, not the kind of dry that split the ground and turned the leaves brown by August, but steady and draining, the kind that took 2-3 inches from what a field needed and left the ears smaller than they should have been. I had been watching the corn since June with the calculation of a man keeping a ledger. I knew what the rows were telling me, and by late July, I knew what they were not going to say. After supper, I took the notebook and a pencil and sat at the kitchen table and did the arithmetic plainly. The corn acreage, 22 cultivated acres, after you subtracted the woodlot and the kitchen garden and the barnyard, was going to yield somewhere between 8 and 10 bushels shy of what I had projected in March. At the going rate, that shortfall meant the corn check would land somewhere around $290, maybe $310 if the co-op's price held. Against $340, and the cost of seed and equipment repairs already carried forward from spring, the numbers did not close. I looked at the figures for a long time. Then I looked at the notebook. Everything depended on the sink. I had known this was possible since April. Now it was simply true. The corn would not cover the debt, and there was no other acre on the property with anything left to give. The rice was still standing. The water was still correct. The plants had headed out through July, the grain clusters beginning to form and weigh down the upper stalks in a way that Mr. Sato had told me to watch for, the way that meant the crop was still on its path. But the harvest was 3 months away, and between now and November 1st, all I could do was manage the water, watch the weather, and keep the calculation from swallowing me whole. I folded the bank letter and set it inside the notebook's front cover, where it would stay until October. The first week of October came in cold and dry, the kind of weather that feels like a held breath. The corn was already cut and shocked, the stalks standing in the east field like gray sentinels with nothing left to say. I had run the final numbers twice in September and put them away. There was nothing more arithmetic could tell me. The sink was something else entirely. By the 1st of October, the rice stalks had gone the color of old honey. Not yellow, not gold, but something between the two. A warmth that had no name I knew in English. Hana's notebook had a word for the color, written in the margin beside a small ink drawing of a bent head of grain. I did not know how to say it. I traced my finger over it the way I had 100 times that summer, as though the sound might come through my skin. The stalks were bowing. That was the thing that stopped me every morning when I walked down to the field before breakfast. Not tipping over, not broken, bowing, the way something bows under the weight of what it is carrying. The grain clusters had filled out across August without any ceremony, without anything I could point to and say, "There, that was the moment." They had simply grown, and now they were heavy enough to bend the stalk they had come from, and the whole field moved in the October wind like something breathing. He arrived on the evening of October 7th, a Wednesday, with a borrowed grain cradle laid flat in the bed of his truck, and 2 large burlap sacks folded on the seat beside him. He set them down by the field gate without a word about the drive from Gibson County, without asking how I was managing. He just looked at the sink for a while and then looked at me. We walked the rows together before the light went. The water was shallow now, just enough to keep the roots cool, and it made a soft sound around our boots as we moved through the rows. The stalks were thick enough to push through gently and not collapse. He ran a hand along a head of grain, testing the weight, and made a small sound that wasn't quite a word. We didn't say much. There wasn't much to say. The field had done its work. Whether it had done enough, the numbers, the bank letter still folded in the notebook's front cover, none of that lived in the sink that evening. It was quiet out there. The creek murmured somewhere behind the tree line, the same water that had drowned this ground every spring for 40 years. I noticed, walking back to the gate in the last of the light, that I had stopped being afraid. The grain would be ready by morning. The morning of October 9th came in cold and clear, the kind of cold that sharpens everything at the edges, the fence posts, the far tree line, the pale sky above the creek. I was in the sink before full light with the sickle I'd sharpened the night before, and Mr. Sato was already there when I arrived, standing at the end of the first row with his own blade, waiting without any indication of impatience. We cut from the outside in, working toward the center, laying the stalks in bundles and tying them with lengths of twine I'd wound around my wrist. The grain heads were heavy enough to bow the stalks in the morning damp. When you cut a bundle and held it upright, you could feel the weight shift in your palms, dense and low, nothing like corn. Mr. Sato moved through the rows without wasted motion, each stroke clean, each bundle set down with care. I watched his hands when I could. They knew what they were doing. We threshed on the second day, beating the bundles against the inside of an old feed barrel I'd cleaned and braced against the gate post. The grain fell in a dry rush that sounded nothing like anything I'd heard before on that farm. By midday October 10th, we had it bagged. 9 burlap sacks, heavy enough that I moved them two-handed, and loaded into the truck bed. The drive into Evansville took 40 minutes. The co-op way station on the river road was busy that Saturday, trucks idling in line, men talking on the loading dock. I pulled up and waited my turn. When the attendant came around to the truck bed, he looked at the sacks and then at me and didn't say anything one way or the other. They ran the bags through the scale one at a time. I stood to the side with a piece of paper and added the numbers as they came. 1,840 pounds. The attendant read the total ticket and handed it to me without ceremony. I looked at the number for a moment. Then I looked at Mr. Sato. He was standing a few feet off, hat in his hands, and he did not put it back on. He didn't speak. He looked at the ticket and then out at the river, and that was all. I didn't see Eldon Marsh until we were moving the empty sacks back into the truck. He was at the far end of the dock, signing something on a clipboard, and he looked up when the attendant called out the total for filing. I saw him read the weight ticket tacked to the co-op board. He stood there a moment, then he went back to his clipboard. He didn't say a word, neither did I. The check from the co-op came on a Thursday, 11 days after the weigh-in. I walked it to the First Farmers Bank in Mount Vernon that same afternoon. The teller was a woman I didn't know, which suited me fine. I wrote the amount in the ledger when I got home, $75.44. Applied to outstanding balance, October 22nd, 1953. The debt wasn't retired. There was still $264.56 remaining, but the number in the column looked different than it had in January, when my grandfather died and left me with the farm and the figure, and not much else. The letter from the county extension office arrived the following week, on a Monday. Harlan Duff's name was typed at the bottom with his title beneath it. He wrote that he had reviewed the Posey County co-op receipts for the fall season and noted the rice yield attributed to my parcel. He requested, formally and in full bureaucratic language, that I consider hosting a demonstration for other bottomland farmers in the county, those with low-lying acreage along Cypress Creek and the Wabash tributaries that had never produced reliable corn. He called it a matter of agricultural interest for the region. He did not mention what he had said at the Grange Hall in April. I read the letter twice on the porch, in the last of the evening light. The air was cold enough that I could see my breath. The fields had gone quiet and brown, and the sink down at the far corner of the property was draining back as it always did in fall, the water pulling away slow and leaving the bare earth behind. In spring, it would flood again. Next year I would be ready for that earlier. I set the letter on top of the notebook, Hannah's notebook. The brass clasp was cold under my thumb. I left them both on the porch table and went inside to start supper. I never framed the letter. It's still there, between the pages, pressed flat by the weight of the leather cover. Here is what I know after 1 year of running this farm alone. There are things waiting in root cellars, in the flooded corners of fields, in the drawers of dead men's desks, that the county has already decided are worthless. They've written off the low ground and the bad soil and the parcels that don't drain right. They've laughed at the boys who bought them for $6, and sometimes they are right to. But sometimes the ground remembers something the county forgot. Sometimes your great-grandmother left you the answer behind a false panel in the east wall, sealed in a mason jar, waiting 22 years for someone to ask the right question. If you found something like that, in a barn, in a cellar, in land everyone told you to leave alone, I'd like to hear about it. Leave it in the comments. And if this story meant something to you, pass it on.